Serena Hayes, a dedicated U.S. Marine, had just returned from 6 grueling months of service in the Middle East. Standing in the middle of Denver International Airport, she felt an overwhelming mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Dressed in her well-worn military uniform, she adjusted the strap of her duffel bag while taking in the sights and sounds of the bustling terminal. The weight of countless curious glances settled on her shoulders, some subtle, others more direct. It was nothing new. Serena had grown accustomed to the stares, not just because she was a soldier, but also because of the color of her skin. Even in uniform, even after serving her country, she still had to navigate a world that often questioned her place in it. As she checked her boarding pass, she was caught off guard. She had been upgraded to first class. A rare stroke of luck. After months of enduring the harsh realities of deployment, this felt like a small but welcome comfort. A quiet sigh of relief escaped her lips as she made her way through security and toward her gate. First-class boarding for Flight 618 to Chicago is now beginning, the PA system announced. Serena stepped forward, handing over her pass, and soon found herself settling into her first-class seat, 3A. The plush cushion and generous legroom were a stark contrast to the cramped and rigid transport planes she had grown used to. She exhaled deeply, finally allowing herself a moment to relax. But the peace didn't last long. A sharp, condescending voice cut through the cabin noise. "Excuse me, but are you sure you're in the right seat?" Serena looked up to find a sharply dressed man in his early 50s standing beside her. His suit was pristine, his watch gleamed under the cabin lights, and his expression was unreadable, except for the unmistakable doubt in his eyes. "This is my seat," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. It wasn't just her presence in first class he questioned. It was something deeper, something unspoken yet painfully clear. His gaze flicked over her uniform, then lingered on her skin. "This is first class," he repeated, as if she didn't already know. Serena met his stare with the quiet patience of someone who had faced far greater battles. She had heard these undertones before, and she knew exactly what they meant. "I believe this is my seat," she said calmly, holding up her boarding pass. 3A, right here." The man's lips pressed into a thin line as he glanced at her ticket. Even with proof in front of him, he still hesitated, unwilling to accept what was clear. "There must be some mistake," he muttered, his arrogance unwavering. "You can't possibly be sitting here." Serena felt frustration stir within her, but she kept her emotions in check. She had learned long ago that anger wasn't always the best weapon. "I'm certain," she replied, her voice steady and firm. "This is my assigned seat." Before the man could argue further, a flight attendant approached, her warm but professional smile masking her awareness of the tension. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her gaze moving between them. The man wasted no time in responding, irritation coloring his words. "Yes, there is," he scoffed. "This woman is in the wrong seat. This is first class, and I don't think she belongs here." The flight attendant barely blinked at his words. She turned to Serena, took a quick look at her ticket, and then smiled. "Miss Hayes' ticket is valid," she confirmed smoothly. "She's in the right seat. There's no mistake." The man's face darkened, his frustration evident. But with no argument left to stand on, he had no choice but to retreat. Muttering under his breath, he stormed off to his own seat. Serena exhaled quietly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. But she could still feel the weight of the eyes around her. Some passengers glanced at her with quiet support, others with disinterest, and a few with lingering skepticism. She had been in far more dangerous situations on the battlefield, yet somehow, moments like these, the silent but heavy judgments, felt just as exhausting. Still, she refused to let it shake her. She had fought for her place in this world, and she wasn't about to let anyone make her feel like she didn't belong. Across the cabin, the man sat stiffly in his seat, his expression still twisted in displeasure. But he wasn't done. He turned back towards Serena, and this time made sure his voice was loud enough for others to hear. "I just don't understand how someone like you could be sitting here." His words carried more weight than just the seat assignment. There was an unmistakable implication in them, a deeper, uglier sentiment that Serena had encountered too many times before. The cabin grew tense, a few passengers shifting uncomfortably, others pretending not to hear. Serena took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain composed. She had endured high-pressure combat zones, but racism still managed to cut deeper than any battlefield wound. She turned to face him, her voice calm but unwavering. "First class isn't determined by skin color," she said evenly. "I have a valid ticket, and I've served my country. If you think I don't deserve to sit here, maybe it's time to rethink what deserving really means." The man's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling over. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had judged so quickly. "I'm sure plenty of people would feel uncomfortable sitting near you," he sneered. "I paid a lot for my ticket, and I won't let someone like you ruin my flight." The words stung, but Serena held her ground. She wasn't here to prove herself to him. She had already proven herself. On the battlefield, in her service, and in every moment she had spent standing tall in a world that tried to diminish her. And she wasn't going to back down now. The man scoffed, shaking his head as if the very sight of Serena sitting in first class was an offense to him. Though he said nothing more, his disapproval was clear in the way he carried himself. He turned away sharply, his body language filled with contempt, making sure everyone around him knew just how he felt. Serena sat back in her seat, exhaling slowly. She had faced hostility before, but somehow the quiet rejection of her presence in this space felt heavier than the battlefield. It wasn't just about a seat, it was about the unspoken belief that someone like her didn't belong here. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling her family's words of encouragement before she left for deployment, and the camaraderie she had built with her fellow Marines. Out there, in the military, your worth wasn't measured by the color of your skin. It was proven by your actions. That was the world she had fought for. And yet, here she was, still having to fight for her place in it. The plane taxied down the runway, the engines roaring as it prepared for takeoff. Serena inhaled deeply, centering herself. The fight against prejudice was far from over, not just for her, but for so many others. As the aircraft ascended into the sky, Serena turned to gaze out the window, watching the city lights shrink beneath the clouds. She had promised herself long ago that she wouldn't let ignorance steal her peace. But this time, something about the encounter stuck with her. She wasn't angry. Anger was fleeting, but she was tired. Tired of the assumptions, the judgment, the silent, and sometimes not so silent, battles she had to fight just to be seen as an equal. She could have ignored the man, pretended none of it happened, and simply enjoyed her flight. But deep down, she knew that silence had never changed anything. So instead of stewing in frustration, she decided to act. Reaching into the small backpack beneath her seat, Serena pulled out a worn notebook and a pen. This notebook had been with her through some of the hardest moments in the Middle East. It held her thoughts, her memories, and the emotions she wasn't always able to voice. Flipping to a blank page, she put pen to paper. "Dear Sir," she began, carefully choosing each word. "My name is Serena Hayes, and I am a Marine in the U.S. military. I've just returned from 6 months of service overseas, and like you, I'm on this flight, heading home." She paused for a moment, reflecting on how to say what she truly wanted to express. She didn't want this to be a lecture or a confrontation. She wanted to offer something more, a perspective he might not have considered before. "I don't believe your words earlier came from outright malice, but rather from something deeper, something we've all been conditioned to see. Society has a way of making us assume who belongs where, who fits into certain spaces, and who does not. But I want you to know that I am just like you. I have fought, sacrificed, and served to protect the freedoms we both enjoy, and I earned my seat on this plane just as much as anyone else here." Serena thought back to her years in the military, to the men and women she had served alongside, people from all backgrounds, all walks of life. "When I joined the Marines, I trained, lived, and fought beside people of different races, religions, and nationalities. On the battlefield, we didn't see each other's skin color. We saw each other's courage. We saw each other's sacrifices. We had each other's backs, no matter what." She let those words settle on the page before continuing. "I hope that when you look at me, you don't just see a black woman in uniform. I hope you see a person who is willing to give everything for her country, just like countless others before me." Memories flooded her mind, of Jamal, her squad mate who had pulled her out of harm's way during an ambush, Of Layla, an army medic who had treated wounded soldiers regardless of where they came from. Of Omar, a local translator who had risked his life daily to help their unit communicate. Bravery has no race. Sacrifice has no color, and respect should have no boundaries. Serena took a deep breath before finishing her letter. I'm not writing this to argue with you. I'm writing it because I believe that sometimes all we need is a chance to see the world differently. If you take anything from this letter, let it be this. The world is changing, and we all have the power to change with it. She set the pen down, staring at the words she had written. Would he read it? Would he even care? Maybe, maybe not. But if there was even the smallest chance that he would, then it was worth it. Carefully, she folded the letter, slipping it into an envelope. Just as she did, she noticed the flight attendant passing by and gently signaled to her. The young woman leaned down with a polite smile. Can I help you with something? Serena hesitated for a second, then nodded. Could you please give this to the man in seat 5C? The flight attendant glanced at the envelope, then at Serena, her expression softening as she seemed to grasp the situation. With a knowing nod, she took the letter and walked away. Serena watched as the letter was delivered, saw the man take it with a frown, clearly puzzled. She didn't expect a response, didn't expect him to suddenly change his entire worldview. But maybe, just maybe, she had given him something to think about. She leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and let herself breathe. She had fought battles in war zones, and now she was fighting one in the sky. As Serena finished writing, a quiet sense of relief washed over her. She knew a single letter wouldn't change the world, nor did she expect it to immediately transform the man's perspective. But it was a step, a small, deliberate act to open a dialogue, to plant a seed of understanding where there had once been only judgment. She folded the letter neatly and slipped it into an envelope, her fingers brushing over its surface for a brief moment before setting it aside. From the corner of her eye, Serena noticed the flight attendant standing nearby, watching her with a gentle expression. "What are you writing?" the attendant asked softly. Serena hesitated for a second, then decided to be honest. "A letter," she replied, "for the man who questioned my seat earlier. I figured, maybe if he understands me better, he might see things differently." The flight attendant's brows lifted slightly in surprise before her expression softened with admiration. "That's a wise and kind approach," she said. "Most people would have just ignored him or responded with anger. I think this letter will make an impression." Serena gave a small nod, tucking the envelope away. She didn't expect miracles, but doing the right thing, even in the face of prejudice, made her feel lighter. Just as she settled back into her seat, the plane lurched unexpectedly. The overhead sign for seatbelts flickered on, and a ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Serena instinctively reached for her seatbelt and fastened it without a second thought. Years of military training had made turbulence feel insignificant compared to what she had faced in the field. But not everyone around her shared her composure. A few passengers whispered anxiously, shifting in their seats. Across the aisle, an elderly woman gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. Her eyes were wide with fear, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Serena immediately noticed her distress and leaned forward slightly. "It's all right, ma'am," she said gently. "This is just a little turbulence. The plane is still perfectly safe. Take slow, deep breaths." The woman turned her gaze toward Serena, her face still pale, but something in the Marine's steady voice anchored her. She exhaled shakily, nodding as she tried to follow Serena's guidance. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. Serena gave her a reassuring smile, and little by little, the tension in the cabin eased. Across the aisle, she could feel eyes on her. She turned her head slightly and met the gaze of the man from earlier. His expression had changed. The hostility from before was gone. His usual sharp, scrutinizing stare had been replaced with something quieter, more uncertain. Curiosity, maybe even respect. Serena didn't hold his gaze for long. Instead, she simply offered him a small nod. Nothing too grand, just a silent acknowledgement. For the first time since boarding, the man didn't look at her with contempt. He didn't scoff, didn't shake his head. He just sat there watching her with something like hesitation, maybe even reflection. The turbulence faded after a few more minutes, and soon, the plane steadied once more. The elderly woman, now visibly calmer, turned to Serena with a grateful smile. "If it weren't for you, I think I would have panicked," she admitted. Serena smiled back. "It's nothing, ma'am. I'm just glad I could help." The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence that followed. Serena took the opportunity to reflect on everything that had happened so far. She didn't know if the letter she had written would truly shift the man's perspective, but she knew that actions spoke louder than words. What mattered more than what she had written was what he had witnessed. He had seen her handle prejudice with patience. He had seen her offer kindness, even when she received none in return. He had seen her calm a terrified stranger, putting someone else's fears before her own. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see her not just as a uniform or a color, but as a person. Serena turned back to her notebook. She had already written the core of the letter, but something inside her told her she needed to add just one more thing. This time, she didn't write to defend herself. She wrote to share the lessons she had learned from the military. Lessons about unity, about kindness, about the bonds forged in places where race, background, or differences didn't matter. She wanted him to understand that what he saw on the surface never told the whole story of a person. What mattered wasn't who someone appeared to be, but who they truly were. As Serena continued writing, she didn't realize that the man had been watching her the entire time. From his seat, he saw her deep in thought, her pen moving deliberately across the paper. He noticed the way she paused, considering her words carefully, as if what she was writing truly mattered. And for the first time, his anger wasn't the dominant emotion on his face. His curiosity grew, no longer fueled by resentment, but by something else. Something that felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Regret. A quiet, creeping understanding that perhaps he had been wrong. The flight attendant returned, making her way down the aisle. Serena looked up and gave a small nod. "Could you please give this to the man in seat 5C?" she asked gently, handing her the envelope. The flight attendant glanced at the letter, then at Serena, her expression unreadable for a moment, before softening into a quiet smile. "Of course." Serena watched as the envelope disappeared into the flight attendant's hands. She didn't expect too much, but she hoped, just a little, that the man would read her words. That, even if only for a moment, he might see the world from a different perspective. She leaned back against her seat, took a deep breath, and let herself breathe. Serena sat back, exhaling deeply as she let herself relax for the remainder of the flight. She didn't know if the letter would truly change anything, but she had done what she could. Sometimes, change didn't happen in grand gestures. It started with a single moment of reflection. As the plane descended, the lights of Chicago O'Hare International Airport twinkled below. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival. Passengers shifted in their seats, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Serena reached for her backpack in the overhead compartment, still feeling the exhaustion from the long flight, but relieved to finally be home. She adjusted the straps and was about to step into the aisle when a voice behind her made her pause. "Excuse me, Miss Hayes." She turned, already recognizing the voice. The man from earlier stood there, but something about him had changed. Gone was the arrogance, the rigid posture. Now he looked uneasy, hesitant, as if struggling to find the right words. I don't mean to bother you," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I read your letter." Serena nodded slightly, waiting, wondering how he would respond. He sighed, looking down for a moment before meeting her eyes again, and this time his gaze held something she hadn't seen before: sincerity. Regret. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I judged you by your appearance, and that wasn't fair." He paused, as if gathering the courage to continue. "I lost my brother in Afghanistan 2 years ago. He was a soldier, and when I saw you..." He exhaled sharply, his voice strained. "I think my anger and grief got the best of me. I took it out on you, and I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Serena blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She had expected resistance, maybe even dismissal. She hadn't expected this. For the first time, she truly saw the pain in his eyes. This wasn't just an apology. It was a man coming to terms with his own grief. A quiet understanding settled between them. "I'm sorry for your loss," Serena said softly, her voice genuine. "Losing someone to war, it's something no one should have to go through." The man swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you." His voice was rough with emotion. "My brother was a good man, and if he were here, I think he wouldn't have approved of how I acted today." Serena smiled gently. "I think your brother would be proud of both of us right now." He looked at her, processing those words. Then, after a moment, he extended his hand, not in obligation, not out of formality, but with genuine sincerity. "My name is David," he said. "It's an honor to meet you." Serena shook his hand, feeling a surprising sense of peace. "Serena." "And it's an honor to meet you too, David." They stood there for a moment, saying nothing else. There was no need. Sometimes, understanding wasn't about words, it was about what was left unspoken. As they both turned to leave the plane, Serena felt lighter than when she had boarded. What had begun as a moment of tension had turned into something else, an opportunity for growth, for healing, for change. As she stepped into the terminal, the familiar warmth of home washed over her. The hum of voices, the sight of families reuniting, it all made her heart swell. And then, she saw them. Her mother, father, and younger sister stood a short distance away, holding a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Serena." Her mother's face was already wet with tears, and as soon as she spotted Serena, she rushed forward, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "You're back safe, my love," her mother whispered through quiet sobs. Her father, standing just behind, looked at her with unwavering pride. "Welcome home, Serena." Serena hugged them both tightly, feeling all the stress, exhaustion, and tension of the past few days melt away. Yes, the battlefield had been dangerous. Yes, she had faced prejudice on this flight. But this moment, being home in her family's arms, was what truly mattered. After collecting her luggage, they made their way to the parking lot. The ride home was filled with warmth, her mother unable to stop asking questions. "How was your flight? Were you tired? Was everything okay?" Serena hesitated. Her mind flickered back to David, the confrontation, the letter, the unexpected moment of reconciliation. She took a deep breath. "Actually," she began, "something happened. It wasn't entirely smooth." The car ride home was filled with warmth, the familiar rhythm of her family's voices easing Serena's lingering exhaustion. But when her mother noticed her hesitation, a quiet concern settled in the car. "What happened?" her father asked, his deep voice steady but curious. Serena took a deep breath. She had faced difficult conversations before, but sharing something so personal with her family was different. Slowly, she recounted everything, from the man who had questioned her place in first class, to how she had chosen to write him a letter instead of responding with anger. She described their final conversation after the flight, when he had apologized and revealed his own pain, carrying the grief of losing a brother in war. Her mother sat in silence, absorbing every word. When Serena finished, her mother reached across the seat and gently took her hands, her eyes filled with emotion. "You handled everything with incredible grace," she said softly, her voice full of pride. "I don't know if I could have done the same." Her father nodded in agreement. "That was a wise decision," he added. "Not everyone has the strength to face prejudice with patience and forgiveness. You've made me proud, Serena." Serena's younger sister Maya had been unusually quiet during the conversation. She sat still, staring at her older sister with admiration. Finally, in a hushed voice, she whispered, "You always do the right thing, Serena. You're not just a soldier, you're changing the world." Serena smiled, gently patting Maya's hand. "I just do what I think is right," she said softly. "But thank you for always believing in me." The rest of the ride home was filled with warmth, a reminder that no matter what challenges she faced, she was never alone. That love, that unwavering support, only strengthened her belief that even when confronted with prejudice, she would always choose understanding over conflict. When they finally arrived home, Serena was greeted with a wave of nostalgia. Her family's cozy house in Milwaukee was decorated with balloons, and the dining table was filled with her favorite dishes. The comforting scent of home-cooked food instantly took her back to childhood memories. Laughter over dinner, warm evenings spent sharing stories with her family before she had enlisted. As they gathered around the table, her parents and sister eagerly asked about her time overseas. She shared moments of camaraderie, resilience, and sacrifice, describing the bonds she had formed with her fellow Marines. The battles they had faced together, the nights they had spent looking out for one another, the friendships that had become as strong as family. But of all the stories, it was her encounter with David on the flight that left the deepest impression. "Everyone carries prejudices in some way," Serena said as she finished the story. "But I believe that through conversation and understanding, we can break down those barriers." She paused, looking at each of them. "David is proof of that. He came onto that plane seeing me as an outsider, but by the end of the flight, he was willing to change his mindset." Her family sat in thoughtful silence before her father placed a strong, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing, Serena," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And you proved something important, that kindness and patience can overcome even the deepest prejudices." Serena smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since returning home, she felt truly at peace. Later that night, as she lay in her childhood bedroom, Serena reflected on everything that had happened. The discrimination she had faced, the decision to write the letter, her unexpected conversation with David. Every moment had reaffirmed the path she had chosen. Even though the world wasn't perfect, she had proven to herself that change was possible. That night, she drifted into sleep, feeling lighter than she had in months. The next morning, golden sunlight streamed through the window, warming Serena's skin. She stretched, enjoying the simple pleasure of waking up at home, safe and surrounded by the people she loved. But as she sat down for breakfast, her mind wandered to the question that had been lingering ever since she stepped off the plane. What's next? Her father must have noticed her pensive expression because he set down his coffee mug and looked at her intently. "Have you thought about the future, Serena?" he asked. "Are you planning to re-enlist, or is there something else you want to do?" His words struck a chord. It was the very question she had been asking herself. Her mother looked up from her plate, her face filled with both concern and love. "Whatever you decide, we'll support you, but I know this isn't an easy choice." Serena took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I still love the military," she admitted. "I love my comrades, the sense of duty, the purpose it gives me." But after everything she had been through, not just on the battlefield, but on the flight with David, Serena realized something important. She had more to give. And maybe her fight was no longer just on the battlefield. Serena sat in quiet reflection, the warmth of her family's support wrapping around her like a shield. "After everything I've experienced," she said finally, her voice steady but thoughtful, "I feel like I can do more outside the battlefield. My encounter with David on the flight made me realize that so many people are still trapped in prejudice and racism. They need help seeing the world from a different perspective, to understand each other better." Her father smiled knowingly, as if he had already anticipated this realization. "My daughter has always thought beyond herself," he said with pride. "Always looking for ways to help others. That's something to be proud of." Serena nodded, the conviction in her heart growing stronger. "I think I can use my experiences to help veterans," she continued, "to help them reintegrate into civilian life. But I also want to work with communities, to break down barriers, to foster understanding. I want to create a world where people see each other for who they truly are, not just for the labels society gives them." Her younger sister, Maya, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "You can do that, Serena. I know you can. You've already inspired so many people, and I believe you'll succeed no matter what path you choose." Serena looked at her, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had always known that her family supported her, but hearing those words from Maya, her little sister who had always looked up to her, made it feel even more real. Her father cleared his throat. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said, "but there is an opportunity you might want to consider." Serena raised an eyebrow. "What kind of opportunity?" Her father hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Mr. Bennett, our neighbor, runs a veterans support organization. He asked about you and mentioned that he'd love to have you on board." Serena blinked in surprise. "Really? What does he want me to do?" "He needs someone to help coordinate programs for veterans," her father explained. "Counseling, job placement, reintegration support. He believes that with your experience, you could make a real difference for those struggling after returning from deployment." Serena sat in silence for a moment, processing the offer. It felt right, like the missing piece of a puzzle she had been trying to put together. A way to keep serving, a way to help both the community and her fellow soldiers. She turned to her mother, seeking the wisdom she had always trusted. Her mother smiled gently. "You've grown so much, Serena. I believe that whatever you choose, you'll make a difference. If this feels like the right path for you, follow it." A deep sense of purpose settled over Serena. This decision wasn't easy, but she knew that with her family's unwavering support, she could step forward with confidence. She wouldn't abandon the values the military had taught her: courage, compassion, and the determination to stand up for what was right. But now her mission would expand. She would serve not just as a Marine, but as a builder of bridges, between veterans, between communities, between people who needed to see the world through new eyes. Taking a deep breath, she turned to her father. "I think I'll meet with Mr. Bennett," she said with certainty. "I want to see how I can help." Her father's eyes gleamed with pride. "That's a great decision, Serena, and I know you'll do something amazing." As breakfast ended, Serena felt as though a new chapter of her life had just begun. Everything she had been through, from battles on the field to facing prejudice on that flight, had shaped her into someone stronger, more patient, more ready to face whatever lay ahead. The future was still uncertain, but Serena was ready. She would keep fighting, not just on the battlefield, but within society, where she could create understanding, where she could make the world better. A few days later, Serena found herself standing in front of a small office in her childhood neighborhood. The sign above the door read, "Veterans United Support Center." It wasn't a grand building, but it had a warmth to it. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs of veterans the organization had helped. Men and women who had once struggled to find their place after coming home, but had been given the tools to rebuild their lives. Each photo told a story. Each framed letter of gratitude carried a weight that couldn't be measured. Taking a deep breath, Serena stepped inside. Behind the desk sat Mr. Bennett, a man in his 60s with a gruff exterior but kind eyes. He looked up as she entered and immediately stood, offering his hand. "Serena," he greeted her with a firm handshake. "Glad you could make it. Your father told me you were thinking about your future. If you're looking for a way to keep serving, we could really use someone like you here." Serena shook his hand, feeling the sincerity in his words. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Bennett," she said. "I've been thinking a lot about how I can use my experience, not just as a Marine, but as someone who understands the struggles veterans face." Mr. Bennett nodded, his eyes shining with hope. "We need people like you, people with heart and dedication. It's not just about helping veterans reintegrate into society, it's about building bridges between them and the community." Serena felt something stir within her. She knew deep down that this was the right path, a way to take everything she had learned, the lessons from war, from home, from that single moment on the plane, and use it to create real, lasting change. This was her next mission. Mr. Bennett leaned forward, his expression serious yet full of warmth. Many soldiers return home not only carrying emotional wounds, but also struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. It's not easy going from combat to community, he explained. People like you, with battlefield experience and a compassionate heart, can make a huge difference. Serena listened intently as he described the work the organization did. It wasn't just about psychological counseling. They helped veterans find jobs, secure stable housing, and rebuild their confidence. They also held educational programs for the community, helping civilians understand the challenges that soldiers faced after war. The more Serena listened, the more she realized this was the path she had been searching for. She looked up at Mr. Bennett, determination settling in her chest. "I'd really love to get involved," she said. "With my experiences, I know I can help veterans regain their confidence and trust in themselves. But more than that, I want to help communities understand and support them better." Mr. Bennett's eyes brightened with satisfaction. "That's exactly what we need," he said. "You could start by organizing a discussion for local veterans next week. It's an annual event we've been hosting for years. This time, if you're willing, you could share your experiences from deployment and what you've learned from your recent encounter on the plane. I think your story would inspire a lot of people." Serena felt a surge of both excitement and nerves. Could her story really make a difference? She thought back to David, the man she had met on the plane. How he had started their journey filled with prejudice and ended it with understanding. If a single moment of honesty and patience could change his perspective, maybe it could help others too. Serena met Mr. Bennett's gaze and nodded. I'd be honored to share my story. The next few days were spent preparing for the event. Serena knew she wouldn't just be sharing her battlefield experiences. She wanted to talk about what she had learned about understanding and tolerance. Her time in the military had taught her that courage wasn't just about facing danger. It was about standing firm in the face of prejudice, about choosing dialogue over division. And now, she had the chance to pass that lesson on. As she wrote down her thoughts, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a bridge between two worlds, between those who had served and those who didn't understand what it meant to come home. On the day of the event, Serena stepped into a small but crowded community hall. More than 50 people had gathered, veterans, their families, and members of the community. Some were familiar faces from her old neighborhood, while others were complete strangers. But among them, sitting quietly in the back, was someone she hadn't expected to see. David, the man from the plane. His eyes weren't filled with doubt or skepticism this time. Instead, there was something else. Genuine interest. The discussion began with other veterans sharing their struggles, their battles with isolation, trauma, and the feeling of being invisible in the world they had fought to protect. Serena listened carefully, her heart aching for the familiar pain in their words. Then, when it was finally her turn, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room grew silent as all eyes turned to her. I want to share a story, she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. She spoke about her early days in the military, the friendships she had built, the sacrifices her fellow soldiers had made. And then she told them about the flight home, about David, about the prejudice she had faced and how she had chosen to respond with patience instead of anger. There are times when we encounter deep-seated prejudices from others, she said, but the important thing is not to react to that hatred with more hate. Instead, we have to give people a chance to understand us. She paused, looking around the room. I chose to write David a letter, not to criticize him, but to explain, to create a connection. And through that connection, we were able to understand each other better. A hush settled over the crowd. Serena saw the eyes of veterans and their families filled with quiet empathy. At the back of the room, David was watching her intently, and this time the respect in his eyes was unmistakable. She took a deep breath and finished with one final thought. I don't know if we can change everyone overnight, but I believe that with kindness and patience, we can build bridges between people, no matter their skin color, religion, or background. The silence in the room lingered for a moment, before it was broken by applause. People approached Serena one by one, thanking her, sharing their own experiences, and expressing how her words had impacted them. Finally, David walked up to her. His expression was different from the first time they had met. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only gratitude. Thank you, Serena, he said, his voice sincere. You've changed me, and I believe, with your story, you'll change many more people. Serena felt a deep sense of fulfillment swell in her chest. She knew her journey was still long, but today, she had taken another important step. She had started to build bridges between veterans and the community, between people with different experiences, between those who once saw only division. Even though she no longer wore a uniform, she was still serving. She was still making a difference. And she knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. Serena had always believed that courage wasn't just about standing firm in battle. It was about standing firm in life. It was about knowing when to fight and when to listen, when to push forward and when to open your heart. And as she stepped out of the hall that evening, she knew she had done something important, not just for the veterans in the room, but for everyone who had listened. A familiar voice called her name. David. He walked toward her, his eyes gleaming with respect, a look Serena had never seen in him before. Serena, you've truly changed my life, he said, his voice filled with something raw and genuine. You've taught me that we can overcome the barriers between us if we just open our hearts and listen. I won't forget that." Serena smiled warmly. "Thank you, David," she said. "We can all learn and grow if we're willing to give each other the chance." As he nodded, she saw something else in his expression: gratitude. Not just for the lesson, but for the second chance to be a better person. That night, as she walked home, Serena felt lighter. Not because her work was done, but because she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. In the weeks that followed, Serena fully immersed herself in the work at Mr. Bennett's organization. She organized discussions. She met with veterans and their families, listening to their deeply personal stories. She helped them rebuild their confidence, find new paths, and rediscover their sense of purpose. But she didn't stop there. Serena expanded her work beyond veterans, bringing her story and lessons to schools, community centers, and organizations. She spoke to students, teachers, parents, anyone willing to listen. She shared what she had learned in the military, not just about combat, but about unity, patience, and compassion. Whenever she stood before a crowd, she wasn't just a veteran anymore. She had become a voice for change, a pioneer in breaking down barriers. And she knew, deep in her heart, that if one single story could change one person's perspective, then hundreds of stories could change an entire community. One afternoon, Serena sat on the front porch with her mother, watching the sun cast golden light across the yard. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of home, of safety, of belonging. And that's when it hit her. Her journey was far from over. But this time, she wasn't walking it alone. She had her family, her fellow veterans, the people she had met and helped along the way. And David, someone who had once looked at her with prejudice, and now looked at her with understanding. Serena smiled to herself. She knew that with each passing day, every small action she took would continue to build a world where understanding replaced fear and compassion overcame division. Because her journey wasn't just about a soldier returning home. It was about someone determined to build bridges, to break down barriers, and to make the world better. And she knew, without a doubt, that she was on the right path, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Serena Hayes' journey is one of overcoming prejudice, facing racism, and choosing understanding over anger. Instead of responding to hate with hate, she used patience and kindness to change the mindset of those around her. Her story reminds us that real change doesn't come from fighting, but from listening, from sharing, and from giving people the chance to grow. With patience and compassion, we can break down the walls that divide us and create a world where people see each other for who they truly are. If you found this story inspiring, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful content in the future.